Last week, I set out to create a tiny ecosystem for shrimp in this plastic drink dispenser. Unfortunately, due to the nature of the vessel, the scape that I created inside was completely obscured by the blurry corners of the dispenser. In this video, I'm starting over. I went to a local store and found this glass terrarium, which is perfect for a miniature ecosystem. I am breaking down the drink dispenser, and I'm going to reuse the plants, hardscape, and substrate to create something different, something better. This is part 2, the jungle jar. I began by removing everything from the drink dispenser. I put the plants in a bucket and poured the water from the dispenser in with them to stay submerged as I was working. In a separate bucket, I saved the substrate. With the plants and substrate set aside, I was ready to start working on the jar. I began by wiping down the glass. This terrarium was dusty. It had likely been sitting on a shelf for some time. Next, I added back in the substrate that I saved from the jar. It was a mix of sand, scatter gravel, aqua soil, and a handful of crushed coral. I prepared my set of scaping tools and then began banking the substrate towards the back of the jar. I intended to create a sloped substrate, which would trick the eye into viewing the aquarium as deeper. I then added sand, capping over the substrate. This would keep the nutrients locked down and out of the water column and create a thick layer to plant in. I went for about an inch thick layer of coverage. This should prevent any aqua soil from creeping towards the top of the substrate. With the substrate done, it was time for hardscape. Last week, I wrapped this piece of spiderwood with java moss. It was attached to dragonstone with pads of cotton soaked in superglue, so I broke them off. I decided to experiment with a different arrangement, inverting the spiderwood with its branches poking out of the top of the jar. I used the dragonstone from the drink dispenser, but this time I arranged them around the base of the spiderwood, almost as if it was a tree growing out behind them. I then reattached the wood to the stones, using the same method of wedging pieces of cotton in areas where the spiderwood touched the dragonstone and soaking them with superglue. This forms a strong bond and ensures that the spiderwood will not float once the jar is filled with water. Next, I added scatter gravel to bring the substrate to life. I added larger pieces intentionally and let small handfuls fall against the larger rocks to create a more natural look. I left the back of the jar empty of gravel to create an area that would be easier to plant into. I began planting with dwarf Sagittaria. I loved the long grassy look of this plant, and I knew that it would grow quickly in the jar. I used it as a mid-ground plant, as I had a new plan for background plants. Before that, I added trimmings of Juncus repens into the foreground. This is a bit of an experiment, as I'm unsure how they will do being trimmed and planted this way. Do you think the Juncus repens will grow like this? Let me know in the comments. And while you're there, don't forget to like and subscribe. It helps me out a lot. Thanks for making it this far in the video, guys. Let's get back to the jar. Before moving on to the background plants, I added this big piece of Anubia sparteri. I think it's a fantastic centerpiece. For the background plants, I decided to add in some trimmings of Vallisneria spiralis. This plant would fill out the background of the jar and accentuate the leafy look of the dwarf sage and the juncus repens. I also added in a few sprigs of bacopa, a fast-growing stem plant that would add a nice variation in texture. The jar was already looking so much better than the drink dispenser. I decided to move it to its shelf and get a better light on it. It was looking jungly, and I loved the composition of plants and hardscape. I was ready to fill it up with water. I added a piece of paper towel to the jar, as to not disturb the substrate or plants while I added the water. I was so happy. Unlike the drink dispenser, I could see inside, and it looked fantastic. I adjusted the plants a little bit and added a few products to get the cycle started. I added Seachem Prime and Stability and a bit of Flourish for the plants. I felt that the jar needed something more, so I added a few pieces of Amazon frog bit to float on the surface. Last, I added a small group of snails to help in cycling the jar. They, along with the aqua soil, will provide a source of ammonia for beneficial bacteria to feed on as the jar establishes a nitrogen cycle. These snails are a mix of ram's horn and bladder snails. They immediately settled in and began exploring the jar. And with that, the jungle jar was finished. I'm really pleased with it, and I can't wait to see how it evolves. The Anubias makes a fantastic centerpiece, and the long leaves of the dwarf Sagittaria and Vallisneria frame it beautifully. I hope that the Juncus repens grows in, but I'm unsure if it will propagate when trimmed this way. I guess it's a bit of an experiment. I think once the moss on the spiderwood starts growing in and covering the thread that I used to attach it, this jar will really start to look vibrant. In a way, the drink dispenser was a great practice for this setup, and I don't think that it was time wasted. If you run into hiccups while setting up an aquarium, don't be afraid to pivot. You may end up with something much more exciting. Thanks for watching, guys, and don't forget to like and subscribe. If you want, leave me a comment and let me know what you think of the jar. Stay tuned for part 3. It probably won't be for a few weeks, but I can't wait to show you how the jar evolves, and I'm excited to add in a small colony of shrimp. If you like this video, check out some of my other ones. There are probably links on the screen right now. See you in the next one.